The hiss of shallots hitting a hot buttered pan was the only prayer Elara knew. It was a sound of survival, a familiar sizzle in the otherwise suffocating silence of her pre-dawn life. In the cramped kitchen of her small Brooklyn apartment, she moved with an economy of motion that spoke of years spent in high-pressure restaurant kitchens. But those days of chasing Michelin stars were a ghost, a distant memory from a life before her world had shrunk to the size of her younger sister Maya's illness. Now her culinary talent was confined to this tiny stage, creating meals for a sister whose appetite was as fragile as her health. Have you ever had a passion so strong it felt like the very core of your being? What is the one thing you do that makes you feel truly alive? Elara chopped herbs with a rhythmic, percussive beat, the fragrant scent of basil and thyme, a small act of defiance against the sterile, antiseptic smell of Maya's medications that seemed to cling to the air. The bills were a mountain, an avalanche of white envelopes that threatened to bury them both. Each day was a tightrope walk over a chasm of debt. For Maya, Elara would walk it without a net. Have you ever felt that you would do anything, absolutely anything, for someone you love? Let us know your thoughts on the power of that kind of devotion. The email arrived at 5:17 a.m., an electronic harbinger of fate disguised as a job offer. It was from a discreet, high-end placement agency she'd sent her resume to months ago in a fit of desperation. The subject line was simply, "Private culinary position, confidential." The offer was obscene, a 6-month contract as a live-in private chef. The salary was a figure so large it seemed like a typo, a number that could erase their debt, fund Maya's future treatments, and buy them a life they could only dream of. But the conditions were unnerving. The client was an ultra-high net worth individual who required absolute discretion. The contract would include an ironclad NDA. The position was at a remote private estate outside the city. For 6 months, there would be no contact with the outside world. No phone, no internet, no leaving the property. All communication with her sister would be handled through a designated, secure channel, managed by the client's staff. It wasn't a job. It was a form of gilded indenture. It was a deal with a devil she couldn't see. She spent the day in a state of agonizing indecision. It was a trap, a fantasy, a mistake. But as she watched Maya struggling to take a few sips of the broth she had so lovingly prepared, the choice became brutally simple. There was no choice. For Maya, she would walk into any cage. The interview was held in a sterile, windowless room in a downtown skyscraper. A woman with a severe haircut and a voice like splintering ice asked her a series of bizarre, hypothetical questions. If a client requested a dish with an ingredient you found morally objectionable, what would you do? How would you handle a medical emergency in the kitchen with no outside communication? It felt less like a chef's interview and more like a psychological evaluation for an astronaut. At the end, the woman slid a thick contract across the table. "Mr. Moretti values privacy above all else," she'd said. "His estate is his sanctuary. Your world, for the next 6 months, will be that estate. Are we clear?" Elara signed her name, her hand surprisingly steady. She was selling 6 months of her life, but she was buying Maya a future. A week later, a black car with tinted windows, as silent and final as a hearse, arrived to collect her. The drive out of the city was a journey into another world. The concrete jungle gave way to winding country roads, flanked by dense, ancient forests. They passed through a set of massive wrought iron gates, the name Villa Alba discreetly etched into the stone pillar. The driveway, a mile-long ribbon of crushed white gravel, snaked through a landscape so perfectly manicured it felt unreal. The estate was breathtaking. A modern fortress of glass, dark stone, and rich mahogany, it was built into the side of a hill, overlooking a private, mist-shrouded lake. It was a masterpiece of architecture, a testament to unimaginable wealth and a profound need for isolation. It was beautiful, serene, and the most intimidating place Elara had ever seen. She was shown to her quarters, a luxurious suite that was larger than her entire apartment, with its own small kitchen and a balcony overlooking the lake. It was a cage, but it was a cage of cashmere and marble. She didn't meet her employer for 2 full days. She was instructed to familiarize herself with the main kitchen, a sprawling, state-of-the-art culinary paradise that made her heart ache with professional joy. It was stocked with the best of everything, from a gleaming La Cornue range to a walk-in pantry filled with ingredients she had only ever dreamed of using. On the third evening, as she was prepping for a dinner she had been instructed to make for one, he appeared. He moved with a preternatural silence. One moment the kitchen was empty, the next he was there, leaning against the doorframe, watching her. He was the devil she had imagined, and he was devastatingly beautiful. Tall and lean, with the kind of sharp aristocratic features that belong to a fallen angel in a Caravaggio painting. He had dark, unruly hair that fell across his brow, and eyes so dark they seemed to absorb the light, revealing nothing. He was dressed in a simple black cashmere sweater and dark trousers, an attire of casual elegance that only served to highlight the coiled, dangerous energy he radiated. "You are Chef Elara," he said. His voice was a low, smooth baritone with a hint of a gravelly edge, a voice that could soothe or command with equal ease. "I am," she replied, her hand stilling on the knife she was holding. "And you must be Mr. Moretti." "Dante," he corrected her, his gaze intense, analytical. He walked into the kitchen, his movements fluid and confident. He didn't look at her. He looked at her hands, at the precise, methodical way she was dicing a shallot. "I trust the accommodations are to your liking." "They're more than adequate," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "Good," he said. He picked up a basil leaf from her prep station, rubbing it between his thumb and forefinger, releasing its scent. "Let me be clear about my expectations, chef. I do not eat for pleasure, I eat for function. My diet is specific. No gluten, no dairy, no nightshades, no refined sugar. Your task is to create meals within these strict parameters that are not only compliant, but exceptional. You are here to provide sustenance, but you are also here to provide a form of art. I expect perfection. In every dish. Every time. Is that understood?" His demands were those of a man with an iron will, a man who sought to control every aspect of his world, right down to the molecules of the food he consumed. "I understand," she said. His dark eyes finally met hers, and for a moment she felt as if he could see every fear, every hope, every secret she had ever held. It was an unnerving, invasive gaze. "I hope you do," he said, his voice dropping. "Because at Villa Alba, perfection is not a goal. It is the baseline for survival." He turned and left as silently as he had appeared, leaving Elara alone in the vast, gleaming kitchen, the scent of basil and a new palpable sense of dread hanging in the air. She looked at the perfectly diced shallots on her cutting board, then at her own trembling hands. She had made a deal with the devil, and now she was in his house, in his kitchen, and she had 6 months to learn how to cook for him, how to survive him. The first weeks at Villa Alba were a study in opulent isolation. Elara's world shrank to the polished steel and cool marble of the kitchen, the quiet luxury of her suite, and the winding garden paths she was permitted to walk in the late afternoons. The estate was run by a skeleton crew of silent, efficient staff who moved like ghosts, their faces impassive, their presence fleeting. They were professionals, experts in the art of being invisible. The only constant, other than the ever-present, unseen security, was Dante. He was a phantom in his own home, a man who seemed to exist in the spaces between moments. She would catch glimpses of him through the large kitchen window, a dark figure walking by the misty lake, lost in a world of his own. But his presence was most acutely felt in the food. He was a demanding, exacting critic, but not in the way a restaurant reviewer would be. He never sent a dish back. He never complained. His feedback came in the form of an empty plate, or a plate with a single uneaten component left behind. It was a silent, infuriatingly precise dialogue. A sprig of parsley left on the side of a plate meant the flavor was too aggressive. A piece of perfectly seared fish with only one bite taken meant the texture was slightly off. Elara found herself obsessed, lying awake at night, deconstructing every meal, trying to understand the palate of this enigmatic man. It was the most difficult culinary challenge of her life. He wasn't just a client with dietary restrictions. He was a puzzle she was compelled to solve. Her professional pride, the very core of her identity as a chef, was on the line. She began to cook for him not just with skill, but with a fierce, analytical intent. She learned that he preferred earthy, grounding flavors, wild mushrooms, truffles, roasted root vegetables. He disliked anything overly acidic or sweet. His palate was disciplined, ascetic, almost mournful. The food he required was the food of a man at war with his own body or his own soul. Slowly, she began to win. The empty plates became more frequent. One evening, she prepared a simple, deeply flavorful wild mushroom risotto, using a gluten-free ancient grain and a rich, homemade vegetable broth instead of cream. The plate came back to the kitchen so clean it looked as if it had been polished. A small, silent victory, but it felt like winning a war. That night, he appeared in the kitchen as she was cleaning up. He didn't speak for a long time, simply watching her, his dark eyes shadowed and unreadable. "The risotto," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. "My mother used to make one like it." It was the first personal detail he had ever shared, a tiny crack in his marble facade. The mention of his mother, spoken in the past tense, hung in the air, filled with a profound, unspoken grief. "It was her favorite," Elara found herself saying softly. "My mother, I mean. She taught me how to make it." A flicker of something, surprise, connection, passed between them. It was a fleeting, dangerous moment of shared humanity. Dante seemed to realize it a second too late, and the mask of cold indifference slammed back into place. But the crack was there. A seed had been planted. He started coming to the kitchen more often, not just to give feedback, but to watch her cook. He would lean against the massive center island, a glass of dark red wine in his hand, and observe her with a silent, unnerving intensity. The first few times it made her hands shake. But she was a professional. She learned to block him out, to focus on the rhythm of her work, the dance of her knife, the sizzle of the pan. Their conversations began, stilted and cautious at first, always with the food as a buffer. "Why do you toast the rice before adding the broth?" he asked one evening, his voice startling her. "It creates a nutty flavor," she explained, not looking at him, "and it helps the grains cook more evenly, so they remain distinct instead of turning to mush. A controlled, deliberate process," he mused, more to himself than to her, "to ensure the integrity of the individual components while creating a unified whole." He wasn't talking about rice. He was talking about strategy, about power, about how he ran his world. Elara began to see that for Dante, everything was a metaphor for control. His diet, his home, his questions about her cooking. It was all part of an obsession with order in a life that was, she was beginning to suspect, built on a foundation of pure chaos. The signs of that chaos were subtle, but they were there. Cars, sleek and black like his, would occasionally arrive in the dead of night and leave before dawn. She would sometimes see men with hard faces and watchful eyes speaking to him in low, urgent tones in the garden. And she was sure, more than once, that she had seen the distant glint of binoculars from the dense woods across the lake. They were not as isolated, as safe, as Dante wanted her to believe. One rainy afternoon, she was in the library, a vast two-story room filled with the scent of old leather and paper, searching for a book on historical culinary herbs. She pulled a heavy tome from a high shelf, and as she did, another, smaller book that had been wedged behind it fell to the floor. It was a photo album. She hesitated, knowing it was an invasion of his fiercely guarded privacy. But the temptation was too strong. She opened it. The album was filled with pictures of a younger Dante, a boy with the same intense eyes but a face full of a light and laughter that was now completely extinguished. There were pictures of him with a man who had his same aristocratic features, his father, and a woman of a stunning, ethereal beauty, with a warm, loving smile, his mother, the lioness from the story Kalen had told. No, this was a new story. The woman was Dante's mother. In many of the photos, there was another boy, slightly older, with a wild, rebellious energy. An older brother. As she turned the pages, the photos became less frequent, the smiles more strained. The final photo in the album was of Dante alone. He couldn't have been more than 18. He was standing in a graveyard, dressed in a black suit, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead, just as it had the night he'd arrived at her garage. The light in his eyes was gone. He was no longer a boy. He was a king, surveying a kingdom of ghosts. A floorboard creaked behind her. Elara's heart leaped into her throat. She slammed the album shut, her hands trembling. It was Dante. He stood in the doorway, his face a mask of stone, but his dark eyes were blazing with a cold, terrifying fury. He had seen the album in her hands. "I told you," he said, his voice a low, lethal whisper that sent a shiver of pure ice down her spine. "There are rooms you do not enter. There are doors you do not open." He walked towards her, his movements slow, deliberate, each step a hammer blow of impending consequence. She had crossed a line, a sacred boundary. She had looked into his past without permission, and in his world, such a transgression had a price. "I'm sorry," she whispered, backing away until she was pressed against the cold, hard shelves. "It fell. I didn't mean to." "You are a cook," he hissed, his voice raw, with a pain he had kept locked away for years. He was so close now, she could feel the heat radiating from him, the sheer, overwhelming force of his contained rage. He braced his hands on the shelves on either side of her head, caging her in. "Your job is in the kitchen. You are to concern yourself with flavors and textures, not with ghosts." She was trapped, her world narrowed to the sight of his furious, beautiful face, the scent of his cologne, the feeling of his power surrounding her. She should have been terrified, and she was. But under the fear, a strange, new emotion sparked to life, a defiant, reckless anger of her own. "You hired me to cook in a house full of ghosts, Dante," she shot back, her voice shaking but strong. "You can't expect me not to hear them rattling their chains." Her defiance seemed to stun him into silence. The fury in his eyes faltered, replaced by a raw, naked shock. No one spoke to him this way. He stared at her, his dark eyes searching her face, and what he saw there, not fear, but a fierce, compassionate strength, seemed to undo him. The anger drained out of him, leaving behind a profound, heartbreaking weariness. He lowered his head, his forehead coming to rest against hers, his breath warm against her skin. "They are my ghosts, Elara," he whispered, his voice broken. "Not yours." In that moment, the line between employer and employee, between captor and captive, dissolved completely. He was just a man, haunted by a past he couldn't escape, and she was the woman who had, against all odds, stumbled into his haunted house and instead of running, had started to turn on the lights. His rage had been a shield, and she had just walked right through it. The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was filled with a new, terrifying, and irresistible possibility. The confrontation in the library became a defining moment, a fault line that shifted the entire landscape of their relationship. The anger, once it had broken through the surface, seemed to have cleared the air, leaving behind a fragile, unnerving honesty. Dante no longer treated Elara as just a highly paid employee. He started to treat her as a confidant, the only person in his isolated world who was not on his payroll, not bound to him by fear or family loyalty, but by a strange, reluctant contract that was slowly, inexplicably evolving into a bond. He never spoke of the photo album again, but the ghosts it had unleashed remained. He began to talk, not in confessions, but in fragments, in stories shared in the late hours in the kitchen, a space that had become their confessional. He would watch her, a glass of wine swirling in his hand, as she expertly broke down a chicken or kneaded dough, and he would talk about his mother. "She loved to garden," he said one night, his gaze distant. "She said you could solve any problem in the world with your hands in the soil. She had a whole garden of culinary herbs right outside this window." Elara looked out the large window at the now immaculate but sterile lawn. "What happened to it?" "After she died, my father had it torn out," Dante said, his voice flat. "He couldn't stand the reminder." He took a sip of his wine. "He replaced it with that. Perfect, green, and empty." It was a small story, but it spoke volumes about the nature of the men in this family, their instinct to erase pain rather than live with it. Without a word, Elara went to the walk-in pantry and returned with a small collection of terracotta pots and a bag of organic soil. She found a packet of basil seeds in the back of a drawer. Silently, she filled the pots and planted the seeds, lining them up on the wide, sunny windowsill in the kitchen. Dante watched her, his expression unreadable. She didn't look at him, her focus entirely on her small act of rebellion, of bringing life back into a space that had been scrubbed clean of it. When she was done, she simply went back to her work. It was a statement. You can't erase everything. Life finds a way. A week later, tiny green shoots pushed their way through the dark soil. Dante would stand by the window and stare at them, a strange, contemplative look on his face. The deeper Elara got, the more she understood the paradox of Dante Moretti. He was a man of exquisite taste, a man who could discuss the nuances of a Sancerre or the brushstrokes of a Renaissance painting, but his life was built on a foundation of brutal, primitive violence. The dichotomy was jarring. One afternoon, she witnessed it firsthand. She was in her private garden, a small glass-enclosed atrium off her suite that she had started cultivating, a sanctuary of green in the cold stone fortress. She was picking tomatoes when she heard voices from the terrace below, Dante's and another man's. She couldn't see them, but their voices carried on the still air. "The shipment is late, Rico." Dante's voice was calm, almost conversational. "And my associates are displeased." "It was a hijack, boss." The other man's voice was slick with fear. "The Falcones. They knew the route." "A hijack," Dante mused. "Or a tip-off. You see my dilemma, Rico. One of these stories involves a traitor. The other involves incompetence. Neither is a story that ends well for you." There was a moment of silence, then the sickening, wet thud of a punch, followed by a choked gasp of pain. Elara froze, her hands full of ripe, red tomatoes, her blood running cold. She had known abstractly what Dante was, but hearing the reality of it, the casual, brutal violence, was another thing entirely. She backed away from the edge of the terrace, her heart hammering, the sweet, earthy smell of the tomatoes suddenly nauseating. She avoided him for the rest of the day, her fear a renewed, icy barrier between them. She cooked his dinner in a cold, professional silence, her hands moving on autopilot. She left the plates for the staff to serve and locked herself in her suite, her appetite gone. He came to her later that night. He didn't knock. He used a key. The sound of the lock turning sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through her. He stepped inside, his dark eyes immediately finding her on the balcony, where she was wrapped in a blanket, staring out at the black, motionless lake. "You heard," he stated. It wasn't a question. She didn't answer, just clutched the blanket tighter around herself. He walked out onto the balcony, the chill night air doing nothing to cool the sudden, suffocating tension between them. "That is my world, Elara," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of apology. "That is what it takes to hold this all together, to keep the wolves from the door, to keep you and your sister safe." "By beating a man half to death on your terrace?" she shot back, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and disgust. "I did not kill him," he replied, his voice still unnervingly calm. "I got the truth, and the truth will allow me to protect my territory, which in turn allows me to continue to pay you the obscene amount of money that is currently paying for your sister's life-saving medical care. Do not stand on this balcony in this house that is bought and paid for with that violence and pretend to take the moral high ground." His words were cruel and they were true. She was a hypocrite. She was living off the proceeds of the very world she claimed to despise. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow. "I am not a good man, Elara," he said, his voice softening, becoming a rough, aching whisper. He stepped closer, and she could see the profound weariness in his eyes, the deep, ancient sadness. "I have never pretended to be. Good men do not survive in my world. They do not build empires. They do not protect the people they love." He reached out, his hand hovering in the air for a moment before he gently, tentatively, touched her cheek. His touch was warm against her cold skin. "I showed you my ghosts. Now you have seen my demons. The question is, can you live with them?" It was the ultimate question. Could she reconcile the man who discussed herbs and watched her son with a gentle smile, with the man who ordered beatings on his terrace? Could she accept the blood money that was saving her sister's life? She looked into his dark, haunted eyes and she saw her own reflection. She saw a woman who was also doing whatever it took to protect the person she loved. Their methods were worlds apart, but their motivations were exactly the same. She didn't pull away from his touch. Instead, she leaned into it, a silent, heartbreaking acknowledgement. "I don't know," she whispered honestly. "I don't know if I can." "Stay," he said, the word a raw, desperate plea. "Stay, and let's find out together." He leaned down and kissed her, And this kiss was different from any that had come before. It was not born of passion or anger, but of a shared, terrible understanding. It was a kiss of shared sins, in a fragile, desperate hope. It was the moment she stopped being just a chef in his house and became an accomplice, a partner in his dark and violent world. She had seen his demons, and she hadn't run. And in his eyes, that made her more beautiful, more valuable than ever before. The kiss on the balcony was a contract signed in shadow and silence. Elara's tacit acceptance of Dante's demons changed the very foundation of their arrangement. The unspoken lines were erased. She was no longer an outsider looking in. She was inside the fortress, and the war outside was now her war too. Her fear didn't vanish, but it transmuted into a kind of hyper-vigilant awareness. The subplots she had only glimpsed before now came into sharp focus. The primary reason for her employment, she soon learned, was far more complex than a rich man's dietary whims. Dante was preparing to host a concilium, a secret summit of the heads of the 5 most powerful families in the country. It was a meeting that hadn't happened in a generation, a high-stakes negotiation to redraw territories, forge a new alliance, and cement Dante's position as the capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. The summit was to be held at Villa Alba, a neutral ground of Dante's choosing, where he could control every variable. And the food was not just sustenance. It was a critical tool of diplomacy, a display of power and respect. In their world, sharing a meal was a sacred act. A perfectly executed feast could build bridges. A single misstep, a dish that was perceived as an insult to a guest's regional tastes, could shatter a fragile truce and ignite a war. Elara wasn't just a chef. She was an essential part of Dante's arsenal. Her kitchen had become the most important room in his empire. The pressure was immense. Dante began to spend his evenings with her, not just watching, but planning. He would detail the backgrounds of each of the 5 Dons who would be attending. Don Gallo from Chicago, he'd say, his voice a low murmur as she perfected a sauce. He is an old-school traditionalist. He sees any deviation from classic Sicilian cuisine as a sign of weakness, of disrespect to the old ways. For him, the sauce must be perfect, simple, rich, authentic. Marco the Bull Travanti from Miami, he'd continue. He's new money, flashy, arrogant. He wants to be impressed. He likes exotic flavors, modern techniques. He wants a show. Elara listened, absorbing every detail. She was no longer just cooking for one enigmatic man. She was creating a culinary symphony designed to navigate the treacherous egos of 5 dangerous kings. Her menus became as complex and strategic as a battlefield map. As the date of the concilium approached, the tension on the estate became a palpable, living thing. Security patrols were tripled. A team of Dante's most trusted men swept the entire estate for listening devices, their faces grim. It was during this lockdown that Elara discovered the second, deeper secret of Villa Alba. One afternoon, she was looking for Dante to discuss the final menu. He wasn't in his study or his usual haunts. One of the maids, a quiet, older woman named Sophia, saw the lost look on Elara's face. "He is with his mother," Sophia whispered, a flicker of sympathy in her eyes. She gestured towards a discreet, unmarked door at the end of a long, quiet corridor Elara had been implicitly forbidden from ever approaching. The West Wing. Drawn by an irresistible curiosity, Elara walked toward it. The door was unlocked. The wing was silent, filled with a soft, filtered light. It felt different from the rest of the house, less like a modern fortress and more like a gentle, quiet sick room. At the end of the hall, through a partially open door, she heard Dante's voice, softer and more gentle than she had ever heard it. "Just a few bites, Mama," he was saying. "Elara made it for you. It's the mushroom risotto, your favorite." Elara peered through the crack in the door. The room was a beautiful, sunlit bedroom. Dante was sitting on the edge of a large bed, a small bowl in his hand. In the bed, propped up by a mountain of pillows, was a frail, elderly woman with wisps of white hair and eyes so dark they were almost black. Dante's eyes. She was the stunningly beautiful woman from the photo album, now ravaged by time and a long, debilitating illness. This was Isabella Moretti, the ghost he had never spoken of, the matriarch who had supposedly died years ago. She wasn't dead. She was here, hidden away, protected from the world, from the consequences of her son's life. Elara's heart ached. The strict, almost fanatical diet Dante adhered to. It wasn't for him, it was for his mother. He had been testing Elara for months, ensuring she could master the complex dietary requirements, ensuring her food was perfect, safe, before he would allow her to cook for the one person in the world he was truly vulnerable to. Her entire employment had been a trial, a test of her skill and her trustworthiness. She backed away from the door, her mind reeling, her heart filled with a new profound understanding of the man, his entire empire, his ruthless control, his violent world. It was all a fortress he had built around this one, fragile, beloved woman. The knowledge changed her. Her mission was no longer just a professional challenge. It was a sacred trust. The night before the Dons were scheduled to arrive, the fragile piece of the estate was shattered. Elara was in the main pantry, doing a final inventory of the pristine, hand-selected ingredients that had been flown in from all over the world. As she checked a crate of prized San Marzano tomatoes, her finely honed chef's senses picked up something wrong. A faint, almost imperceptible chemical smell. Something acrid and out of place. She examined the crate more closely. On the underside of one of the wooden slats, she saw a dark, oily stain. It hadn't come from a rotten tomato. Her blood ran cold. She knew with a certainty born of pure instinct what it was. A subtle, slow-acting poison designed to taint the food, to bring sickness and suspicion into the heart of the concilium. It was an act of sabotage. The Falcones. They were the one rival family not invited to the summit. A family Dante was in the process of crushing. This was their desperate final move. She now faced the same choice she had on the balcony, but 1,000 times more dire. She could ignore it. She could pretend she hadn't seen anything. She could cook the food, let chaos erupt, and in the ensuing confusion, she could take her sister's money and run. It was her one chance at a clean escape, or she could tell Dante. She could step forward, not as his employee, but as his ally. She could choose a side. She could tie her fate to his, irrevocably, in a war where the stakes were no longer just her freedom, but her very life. She thought of Maya. She thought of the money that was her sister's future. Then she thought of Dante sitting by his mother's bedside, his voice a gentle murmur. She thought of his haunted, lonely eyes. She thought of his hand in hers, the silent promise of protection. She took one of the tainted tomatoes, wrapped it in a cloth, and walked out of the pantry, her face set in a mask of grim resolve. She had made her choice. She was no longer a neutral party. She was picking a side. She was walking into the heart of the fire. She found Dante in his study, staring at a map of his world. "We have a problem," she said, her voice clear and strong. She placed the tomato on his desk. "Your war has come to my kitchen." Dante's reaction to the poisoned tomato was terrifying in its stillness. He didn't rage, he didn't shout. A profound, lethal calm settled over him, the kind of quiet that precedes an earthquake. He picked up the tomato, his dark eyes examining it with a chilling, forensic intensity. The air in the study grew cold, the silence so absolute that Elara could hear the frantic beating of her own heart. "Where?" he asked, his voice a low, flat whisper. "The crate of San Marzanos." "Delivered this afternoon," she replied, her own voice a testament to the control she was forcing upon herself. "The supplier was new, one your usual man recommended because he was unavailable." Dante's jaw clenched. A compromised supply chain, a classic, predictable move. He looked at her, and the coldness in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of something else, a deep, profound respect. "You have good instincts, chef. Most would have missed it. You saved us all from a very unpleasant dinner." He crushed the tomato in his fist, its red pulp and seeds dripping onto the polished mahogany of his desk like blood. "They wanted to create chaos," he mused, "to turn the families against each other at my own table, to make me look weak, unable to guarantee their safety, even in my own home." He looked up at Elara, a slow, dangerous smile touching his lips. "They have made a grave miscalculation. They have mistaken my hospitality for a vulnerability. And they have underestimated my chef." In that moment, the dynamic between them crystallized. She wasn't just his cook or his confidant, she was his partner, his first line of defense. Her kitchen was the battlefield, and her senses were his early warning system. "The concilium will proceed as planned," he declared, his voice ringing with a newfound ironclad authority. "We will not show fear. We will not change a single detail, but we will change the guest list." The plan they devised together was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, a trap laid with cutlery and fine china. Elara's role was central. She would prepare the feast exactly as planned, a symphony of flavors designed to honor and impress the five powerful dons. But one course, the main pasta dish featuring the San Marzano tomato sauce, would be her weapon. The day of the concilium, Villa Alba was transformed. The quiet, isolated estate became the epicenter of the underworld's power. A procession of armored limousines snaked up the long driveway, each delivering a king to Dante's court. The air was thick with tension, with the weight of old rivalries and fragile new alliances. Elara had never felt such pressure. Her kitchen was now guarded by Dante's most elite men. Every ingredient, every pot, every pan was inspected. She moved through the chaos with a calm, focused intensity, her team of hand-picked sous chefs brought in under heavy guard, following her every command. She was a general, and this meal was her magnum opus. The dinner began. Each course was a work of art, a diplomatic triumph. The old-school Don Gallo praised the simple, perfect flavors of his appetizer. The flashy Don Travanti marveled at the modern, daring presentation of his. Elara, watching from a small monitor connected to the dining room, felt a surge of pride. She was speaking a language these men understood, the universal language of respect communicated through food. Finally, it was time for the main course. The pasta. The staff, all of them, Dante's most trusted men disguised as waiters, served the dish. 6 plates had the pure, untainted sauce. The 7th plate, the one placed in front of Don Falcone, who had been given a last-minute surprise invitation to the summit, had a sauce made from the compromised tomatoes. It was not poisoned to kill, but to expose. Elara had, under Dante's guidance, neutralized the poison, but kept the chemical markers that would identify its source. As the dons began to eat, Dante rose from his seat at the head of the table, a glass of wine in his hand. "My friends," he began, his voice smooth as silk, "I am honored to have you in my home. It has come to my attention, however, that one among you does not share our spirit of brotherhood. One among you sought to turn this sacred table into a field of battle." A tense silence fell over the room. Don Falcone, a portly man with nervous, shifty eyes, had stopped eating, a small, dark stain from the sauce on his white napkin. Dante gestured to one of his men, who brought a small, sophisticated chemical testing kit to the table. "My chef," Dante continued, his dark eyes locking on Falcone, "has a most discerning palate. She noticed an impurity in some of our ingredients. A signature poison, I'm told, favored by the Falcone family." He took the napkin from Falcone's place and dipped a test strip into the tomato stain. It instantly turned a deep, incriminating blue. Gasps echoed around the table. It was undeniable proof. Falcone was caught, red-handed, in an act of unforgivable treachery in front of the most powerful men in their world. Falcone's face turned ashen. His fate was sealed. He had broken the sacred code of their world. There was no trial, no appeal. Dante simply gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to his men. The justice that followed was swift, brutal, and silent. The concilium continued as if nothing had happened. The remaining dons now united, not just by a new alliance, but by the shared, chilling display of Dante's power and precision. He had not only defended his throne, he had fortified it with the blood of his enemy. Later that night, after the last Don had departed, after the alliance was forged and his empire was secure, Dante came to the kitchen. Elara was alone, wiping down the silent stainless steel counters. The adrenaline had faded, leaving her trembling with exhaustion and the moral weight of what she had done. He came and stood behind her, his presence a familiar comfort. He placed his hands on her shoulders, gently turning her around to face him. He looked down at her, his dark eyes filled with an emotion so profound it made her heart ache. "Tonight," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper, "you were not just a chef, Elara. You were a queen. You sat at my side, and you helped me win a war." He handed her an envelope. It contained a cashier's check for an amount that made her gasp, and a folder with a new passport, a new identity, and a plane ticket to anywhere in the world. Your contract is fulfilled, he said, his voice flat, but his eyes told a different story. You are free. I promised I would keep you safe. The only way to be truly safe is to be far away from me. She looked at the folder, the ticket to a new, clean life. The life she had been fighting for. The life that would guarantee Maya's future. It was everything she had ever wanted. She pushed it back across the counter towards him. I don't want to be safe, Dante, she said, her voice shaking but clear. I want to be with you. A look of profound, heart-stopping relief washed over his face. He pulled her into his arms, his embrace fierce and possessive. To be with me is to be in the line of fire, he murmured into her hair. You are my line of fire, she replied, her arms wrapping around his neck. I'm not running anymore. He kissed her then, a deep, soul-searing kiss that was not an ending, but a beginning. It was the first day of their new, dangerous, and magnificent empire. She had come to his house as a cook, a prisoner, a means to an end. She was staying as its heart, its soul, its queen.